Hey everyone, tonight we're taking a journey back to colonial America, where survival wasn't a lifestyle choice, but a daily battle against forces that would make modern hardships look like minor inconveniences. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You wake up before dawn in a one-room cabin where the walls are so thin you can hear every cough from your neighbor's house 50 yards away. The fire has died during the night, and frost covers the inside of your windows. Your breath forms clouds in the air as you stumble toward the cold hearth, knowing that without rekindling those flames, your family might not survive the morning. This wasn't poverty. This was Tuesday in colonial America. The year is 1650, and you've just been transported back to a time when a simple splinter could kill you, when chocolate was rarer than gold, and when taking a bath was considered dangerous to your health. Most people today couldn't survive a single week in this world, let alone the decades our ancestors endured. Tonight, we're exploring exactly why colonial life would break the average modern person within hours. But first, let me paint you a picture of what awaited anyone brave or foolish enough to cross the Atlantic in search of a new life. The journey itself was a preview of the horrors to come. Ships packed with desperate souls sailed for months through storms that could snap masts like twigs. Disease spread through the cramped quarters faster than gossip in a small town. Many passengers never saw land again, their bodies committed to the depths of an unforgiving ocean. Those lucky enough to survive the crossing found themselves deposited on shores that promised opportunity, but delivered only endless struggle. The new world wasn't new. It was ancient, wild, and utterly indifferent to human ambition. Every sunrise brought fresh challenges that would test the limits of human endurance. Let's start with something as basic as staying warm. In colonial America, heat wasn't a thermostat adjustment away. It was a constant, exhausting battle against the elements. Families gathered around massive fireplaces that consumed enormous amounts of wood, yet barely heated the rooms they occupied. Children slept 3 to a bed, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Body heat was often the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. Wood gathering wasn't a weekend camping activity. It was a matter of life and death that consumed entire days. Men and older children would venture into forests filled with wolves, bears, and hostile tribes to collect enough timber to last through brutal winters. A single day without adequate fuel meant watching your family slowly freeze while helpless to change their fate. The fireplaces themselves were architectural marvels of inefficiency. They sent most of their heat straight up the chimney while filling rooms with thick smoke that stung eyes and burned lungs. Families developed chronic respiratory problems that modern medicine would recognize as serious conditions, but colonial Americans simply accepted as normal parts of existence. Now imagine trying to cook every meal over an open flame while managing a dozen other survival tasks. Colonial women spent their entire days crouched over fires, stirring pots, turning spits, and desperately trying to prevent their families from starving or poisoning themselves with spoiled food. There were no refrigerators, no preservatives, no safety regulations. Meat spoiled within hours in summer heat. Milk soured before it could be consumed. Vegetables rotted in root cellars that provided minimal protection against decay. Food preservation required skills that took years to master and constant vigilance to maintain. Salt was precious and expensive. Smoking houses needed careful temperature control that one mistake could ruin. Pickling required precise measurements of ingredients that were often unavailable or prohibitively costly. Families survived on diets so monotonous and nutritionally deficient that scurvy, rickets and other diseases were commonplace. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of colonial nutrition was how little food there actually was. Modern Americans consume more calories in a single fast food meal than many colonists ate in entire days. Harvest failures meant genuine starvation. Bad weather could doom entire communities to slow death by hunger. Children grew up with permanently stunted growth from chronic malnutrition that their parents were powerless to prevent. Water, something we take completely for granted, was a constant source of danger and disease. Wells were shallow and easily contaminated by human waste, animal carcasses, and runoff from primitive industries. Rivers and streams served as both water sources and sewage systems, creating breeding grounds for deadly bacteria that colonists couldn't see or understand. Most colonial Americans drank weak beer or cider because fermented beverages were safer than water. Yes, entire families, including small children, consumed alcohol with every meal because it was literally the healthiest option available. Parents gave diluted beer to toddlers, not out of negligence, but out of desperate attempts to keep their children alive in a world where clean drinking water was essentially non-existent. Disease spread through colonial communities like wildfire through dry grass. Smallpox, typhoid, dysentery, and dozens of other killers swept through settlements regularly, claiming lives with terrifying efficiency. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no understanding of germs or sanitation. Families watched helplessly as loved ones succumbed to illnesses that today would require nothing more than a trip to the pharmacy. Medical treatment consisted largely of bloodletting, herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness, and prayer. Doctors were rare, expensive, and often more dangerous than the diseases they claimed to treat. Surgery without anesthesia was performed on kitchen tables by candlelight. Infection killed more patients than the original injuries or illnesses that brought them to medical attention. Childbirth was essentially a death sentence lottery that every woman faced repeatedly throughout her reproductive years. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. Babies died so frequently that parents often waited months before naming newborns, expecting death rather than hoping for survival. Large families weren't signs of prosperity, but desperate attempts to ensure that a few children might live to adulthood. The physical labor required for colonial survival would destroy modern bodies within days. Men cleared forests using nothing but axes and saws, working from sunrise to sunset in conditions that would violate every workplace safety regulation ever written. Women churned butter by hand, hauled water from distant wells, and maintained households without any of the conveniences that make modern domestic life manageable. Children weren't protected from this harsh reality. They worked alongside adults from the moment they could walk, performing dangerous tasks that would horrify contemporary parents. 5-year-olds tended fires that could easily burn down entire settlements. 7-year-olds operated machinery that regularly maimed or killed adult workers. Childhood, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist in colonial America. But the challenges weren't just physical. The psychological toll of colonial life was equally devastating. Isolation was crushing and absolute. Families lived for months without seeing another human being outside their immediate household. News from the outside world arrived sporadically and was often months out of date. The loneliness and mental strain of such complete separation from civilization broke minds as easily as the physical hardships broke bodies. Fear was a constant companion that never left colonial Americans alone. Fear of starvation, disease, wild animals, hostile tribes, and natural disasters that could destroy years of backbreaking work in minutes. Every night brought uncertainty about whether morning would find the family alive, healthy, and still in possession of their meager belongings. Weather wasn't an inconvenience in colonial America. It was a merciless executioner that struck without warning and showed no mercy to the unprepared. Hurricanes demolished entire settlements in hours, leaving survivors to rebuild from nothing, while winter approached with deadly inevitability. Tornadoes carved paths of destruction through carefully cultivated farmland, erasing months of labor in minutes. Floods swept away livestock, homes, and people with equal indifference. But it was the everyday weather that truly tested colonial endurance. Summer heat, combined with primitive clothing and constant physical labor, created conditions that would hospitalize modern people within hours. Men working in fields wore heavy wool garments because cotton was a luxury beyond reach. Women tended fires in long dresses and multiple layers of undergarments, fainting from heat exhaustion while trying to prepare meals for hungry families. Winter, however, was when colonial America revealed its most savage nature. Temperatures plummeted to levels that turned spit into ice before it hit the ground. Blizzards buried settlements for weeks at a time, trapping families with whatever food and fuel they had managed to stockpile. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives with ruthless efficiency. People froze to death in their own beds, despite being surrounded by family members desperately trying to share body heat. The clothing that colonists wore would seem absurdly inadequate to modern eyes. Shoes were often nothing more than leather wrapped around feet, offering minimal protection against rocks, thorns, and bitter cold. Socks were luxuries that most people never owned. Underwear, when it existed at all, was rough cloth that chafed skin raw during long days of physical labor. Women's clothing was particularly torturous. Corsets made from whalebone or wood restricted breathing and movement, making even simple tasks exhausting. Heavy skirts dragged through mud, snow, and worse, becoming breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. Washing clothes was a day-long ordeal that involved hauling water, building fires, and scrubbing fabrics by hand until fingers bled. The concept of personal hygiene that we consider basic human decency simply didn't exist in colonial times. People bathed perhaps once or twice per year, believing that frequent washing would weaken their bodies and invite disease. Teeth rotted out of skulls because dental care consisted of pulling infected teeth with pliers or living with constant agony. Hair was rarely washed, becoming home to lice, fleas, and other parasites that fed on human blood. Toilets were outdoor structures that offered no protection from weather, wild animals, or hostile humans. Chamber pots were emptied into streets or rivers, creating sanitation nightmares that spread disease faster than gossip. Privacy was an unknown concept. Families shared single rooms where every bodily function was witnessed by multiple generations living in cramped quarters. The tools that colonists used for daily survival would be recognized today as primitive torture devices. Axes were heavy, poorly balanced instruments that required enormous strength to wield effectively. Saws were dull blades that demanded hours of exhausting labor to cut through single logs. Plows were wooden contraptions that barely scratched the surface of soil packed harder than concrete. Farming in colonial America was a gamble with death as the stakes. Seeds were planted by hand in soil that had been cleared by backbreaking labor. Weeds grew faster than crops, requiring constant attention that left farmers bent over in fields from dawn until dusk. Insects devoured entire harvests, while families watched helplessly, knowing that crop failure meant starvation during the coming winter. Livestock required constant protection from predators that viewed cattle, pigs, and chickens as convenient meals. Wolves, bears, and mountain lions roamed freely through settlements, attacking animals and humans with equal ferocity. Farmers slept with loaded muskets, knowing that a single night's inattention could cost them their only sources of meat and milk. The economic realities of colonial life would bankrupt modern families within weeks. Everything cost enormous amounts of money that most people simply didn't have. A single iron nail was precious enough to be saved and reused multiple times. Glass windows were so expensive that most homes had shutters instead, leaving interiors dark and cold throughout long winter months. Credit didn't exist in any meaningful form. Families survived on barter systems that required constant negotiation and left everyone vulnerable to the dishonesty of their neighbors. A bad harvest or dead livestock meant immediate poverty with no safety net to prevent complete destitution. debt was inherited by children who spent their entire lives working to pay off obligations they had never incurred. Transportation was a nightmare that made every journey a potential death sentence. Roads were nothing more than dirt paths that turned into impassable mud during rain and treacherous ice during winter. Horses were expensive luxuries that most families couldn't afford to buy, feed, or maintain. Walking was the primary means of travel, even for distances that would take days to cover on foot. River crossings were particularly hazardous endeavors that claimed countless lives. Bridges were rare and often unreliable structures that collapsed without warning. Ferries were operated by individuals whose competence and honesty were always questionable. Many colonists drowned attempting to ford streams that appeared shallow, but concealed deadly currents and hidden obstacles. Communication with the outside world moved at the pace of human feet or horse hooves. Letters took months to reach their destinations, if they arrived at all. News of important events reached remote settlements weeks or months after they had occurred. Families lived in complete ignorance of wars, political changes, and natural disasters that might directly affect their lives. The legal system that governed colonial America was arbitrary, corrupt, and often deadly. Justice was dispensed by magistrates who had no formal training and answered to no higher authority. Punishments were severe and public, designed to terrorize communities into compliance rather than rehabilitate offenders. Minor infractions could result in whippings, brandings, or time in stocks, where victims were pelted with rocks and garbage by their neighbors. Women had essentially no legal rights and existed entirely at the mercy of their husbands, fathers, or other male relatives. They couldn't own property, enter contracts, or make decisions about their own lives. Domestic violence was considered a private matter that authorities rarely investigated or punished. Widows were often left destitute and dependent on the charity of communities that had little to spare. Education was a luxury that most colonial children never experienced. Schools were rare, expensive, and limited to basic literacy skills that few people ever mastered. Books were scarce and costly, making self-education nearly impossible even for those with motivation to learn. Most colonists lived and died without ever reading anything more complex than simple religious texts. The entertainment that colonial Americans enjoyed would strike modern people as either boring beyond comprehension or horrifying in its brutality. There were no theatres, no concerts, no books worth reading. Social gatherings revolved around religious services that lasted for hours, featuring sermons designed to terrify listeners into absolute submission to divine authority. Children learned to sit motionless on hard wooden reaches, describe benches while PD the torments awaiting sinners in graphic detail that would traumatize modern audiences. When colonists did find time for recreation, their idea of fun involved activities that today would be considered animal cruelty or public health hazards. Bear baiting, cockfighting, and public executions drew crowds who cheered as living creatures suffered for their amusement. Dancing was considered sinful by many religious communities, leaving young people with few outlets for social interaction or physical expression. Music existed, but was limited to simple hymns played on crude instruments that produced sounds barely recognizable as melodies. Professional musicians were virtually non-existent in most settlements. Families' long winter evenings gathered around fireplaces on sing-songs passed down through oral tradition, their voices competing with the howling wind and crackling flames for attention. The concept of privacy that modern people consider a basic human right was completely unknown in colonial America. Families lived, worked, ate, slept, and died in single rooms where every conversation could be overheard by everyone present. Personal secrets were impossible to maintain in communities where everyone knew intimate details about their neighbors' lives, finances, health problems, and family disputes. Marriage wasn't about love or compatibility, but about economic survival and social necessity. Young women were essentially property transferred from fathers to husbands through negotiations that resembled livestock transactions more than romantic partnerships. Divorce was virtually impossible to obtain and carried social stigma that could destroy entire families. Couples trapped in miserable marriages had no choice but to endure decades of unhappiness with no hope of escape or improvement. Pregnancy and childbirth occurred in conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Women gave birth at home with assistance from untrained midwives who had no understanding of sanitation, infection control, or emergency procedures. Complications that today would require simple medical interventions killed mothers and babies regularly. Families accepted these deaths as inevitable parts of life rather than preventable tragedies. The infant mortality rate was so staggering that parents developed emotional defense mechanisms to cope with losing children. Babies who died within their first year were often buried without elaborate funerals or extended mourning periods. Mothers who lost multiple infants learned to suppress their grief because dwelling on tragedy interfered with the constant work required for family survival. Even successful pregnancies resulted in children who faced immediate dangers from the moment of birth. Babies were swaddled in rough cloth that chafed their delicate skin raw. Cradles were placed near fireplaces where sparks could easily ignite bedding and clothing. Toddlers crawled on dirt floors contaminated with animal waste, human waste, and decomposing organic matter that bred deadly bacteria. The toys that colonial children played with would be banned by modern safety regulations within minutes of their discovery. Sharp knives, loaded firearms, and dangerous tools were left within reach of curious toddlers who had no understanding of the injuries they could inflict on themselves or others. Play often involved mimicking adult work activities, meaning children practiced using axes, operating looms, and handling livestock before they were physically capable of controlling these dangerous implements. Education for girls was considered unnecessary and potentially harmful to their moral development. Most colonial women never learned to read or write beyond signing their names with crude letters. They were taught domestic skills like spinning, weaving, and cooking, but forbidden from studying mathematics, science, or literature that might give them ideas above their predetermined station in life. The few education were viewed with suspicion by women who did receive their communities. Intelligence in females was considered unnatural and possibly evidence of witchcraft or demonic possession. Educated women were often shunned, accused of corrupting social order, or subjected to formal investigations that could result in imprisonment, exile, or execution. Religious extremism dominated every aspect of colonial life in ways that would be considered oppressive, even by the standards of authoritarian regimes. Church attendance was mandatory, with penalties for absence that included public humiliation, fines, and physical punishment. Sermons lasted for hours and focused primarily on human depravity, divine wrath, and the certainty of eternal damnation for anyone who failed to demonstrate proper piety. The Sabbath wasn't a day of rest, but a 24-hour period of enforced religious observance that prohibited work, travel, cooking, cleaning, or any activity that might be construed as pleasure. Families sat in cold houses eating cold food while reading religious texts aloud, in voices that grew hoarse from hours of continuous recitation. Children who showed signs of restlessness or boredom faced severe punishments designed to teach them proper reverence for holy obligations. Superstition governed colonial decision-making in ways that modern people would find incomprehensible. Important choices were made based on dreams, omens, and folk beliefs that had no basis in reality. Farmers planted crops according to lunar phases, treated illnesses with rituals involving animal sacrifices, and attributed natural disasters to moral failings within their communities. Witch hunts weren't isolated historical curiosities, but regular features of colonial justice that destroyed countless innocent lives. Accusations of witchcraft could be triggered by anything from unusual weather patterns to personal grudges between neighbors. Women who were too independent, too intelligent, too successful, or simply too different from community norms found themselves facing charges that carried death sentences. The trials themselves were mockeries of justice that would be laughable if they weren't so tragic. Evidence consisted of spectral testimony, unexplained coincidences, and confessions extracted through torture or threats against family members. Defendants had no right to legal representation and were presumed guilty unless they could prove their innocence through impossible tests like surviving submersion in water while bound hand and foot. Natural disasters struck colonial settlements with devastating regularity, wiping out years of progress in minutes and leaving survivors to start over from nothing. Earthquakes toppled poorly constructed buildings, burying families under tons of timber and stone. Fires spread through communities built entirely of wood and thatch, consuming entire settlements faster than residents could flee to safety. Floods were particularly catastrophic because colonial Americans had no understanding of watershed management or flood control. Communities built in floodplains because the soil was fertile, then watched helplessly as spring thaws and summer storms swept away their homes, livestock, and carefully tended crops. Survivors often faced starvation because emergency food supplies were destroyed, along with everything else they owned. Droughts could last for years, turning fertile farmland into barren wasteland that supported neither crops nor grazing animals. Wells dried up, leaving communities without access to water for drinking, cooking, or basic sanitation. Families were forced to abandon their homes and migrate to distant regions where they had no connections, no resources, and no guarantee of finding better conditions. The insects that plagued colonial Americans were more than mere annoyances. They were vectors of disease, destroyers of food supplies, and sources of constant physical torment that drove people to distraction. Mosquitoes carried malaria and yellow fever that killed thousands annually. Flies contaminated food with bacteria that caused dysentery and other intestinal diseases. Fleas and lice spread typhus through overcrowded settlements where personal hygiene was impossible to maintain. Crop-destroying insects could devastate entire regions in single seasons, leaving communities to face winter without adequate food supplies, ust swarms dev. Lockhored everything green for miles around their path, stripping fields bare and leaving farmers with nothing to harvest. Caterpillars, beetles, and other pests multiplied unchecked because colonists had no effective methods for controlling their populations. Even indoor spaces offered no refuge from insect torment. Bedbugs infested mattresses made from corn husks and feathers, making sleep miserable and rest impossible. Termites and carpenter ants weakened wooden structures until they collapsed without warning. Moths destroyed precious cloth and clothing, leaving families with inadequate protection against harsh weather conditions. The isolation that colonial families endured would break modern people psychologically within weeks. Settlements were separated by vast distances that could take days to travel under ideal conditions. During winter months, communities were completely cut off from outside contact for weeks or months at a time. Families lived in complete ignorance of whether their neighbors were alive, dead, or in desperate need of assistance. Mental illness was neither understood nor treated in colonial America. People suffering from depression, anxiety, or other psychological conditions were considered lazy, possessed by demons, or punishment from God for hidden sins. Families dealt with mentally ill relatives by restraining them, hiding them from public view, or simply abandoning them to die alone in wilderness areas. The constant stress of survival created psychological damage that manifested in ways colonial Americans couldn't recognize or address. Children who witnessed repeated deaths, violence, and trauma grew into adults who were emotionally stunted and incapable of forming healthy relationships. Parents who lost multiple children often became withdrawn, bitter, or completely dysfunctional. Sleep deprivation was another invisible killer that slowly destroyed colonial minds and bodies. The constant vigilance required for survival meant that true rest was a luxury few could afford. Parents took turns staying awake to tend fires, guard against predators, and watch over sick family members. Even when exhaustion finally overwhelmed them, sleep was fitful and interrupted by every creak, howl, or unusual sound that might signal danger approaching under cover of darkness. The beds themselves were instruments of torture disguised as furniture. Mattresses were nothing more than sacks filled with corn husks, straw, or whatever organic material families could gather. These makeshift sleeping surfaces harbored insects, developed mold from moisture, and provided minimal cushioning against hard wooden bed frames. Multiple family members shared single beds not by choice but by necessity, creating cramped conditions where personal space was non-existent, and disease spread rapidly between sleeping bodies. Nightmares weren't just psychological phenomena in colonial America. They were accurate reflections of daily reality that followed people into their few hours of unconsciousness. Children who witnessed violent deaths during relived those horrors in dreams that left them screaming and thrashing throughout the night. Adults who survived disease outbreaks dreamed of watching loved ones die slowly from illnesses they were powerless to cure or prevent. So there you have it. The next time you complain about slow internet, expensive coffee, or a cold morning commute, remember the colonial Americans who faced genuine life or death struggles every single day. Their world was a place where survival itself was an achievement, where comfort was unknown, and where death lurked behind every mundane task. We've only scratched the surface tonight of the countless hardships that would humble any modern person within hours. Sweet dreams, and perhaps tomorrow you'll wake up with a bit more appreciation for the luxuries we call ordinary life.